you. So good morning, everyone, Your Excellencies, and welcome indeed to the third edition, thank you, Eva, of our Brussels Indo-Pacific dialogue, convened by CSDS, the Center for Security, Diplomacy and Strategy at the Brussels School of Governance. As Eva was mentioning, we launched this dialogue 2 years ago, and it was inaugurated by a now former High Representative, Josep Borrell, who's been former for a couple of days. We're all getting adjusted to the new situation. And in our previous edition at the beginning of this calendar year, we also had the privilege of welcoming Belgian Prime Minister Alexander De Croo, who was also the rotating president of the EU Council at the time. This year, as Eva was mentioning, we're going to zoom in on into patterns of competition and cooperation between key powers in the Euro-Atlantic and Indo-Pacific regions. This is, by the way, the subject of a project that we are currently working on, sponsored kindly by the Australian Department of Defence, and that we are developing in cooperation with the US Studies Centre at the University of Sydney and the Centre for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, our partners who are here today. Now, in the last few years, as you know, we've seen both NATO and the European Union afford more and more priority importance to cooperation with so-called like-minded partners in the Indo-Pacific, not only in security and defense, but also beyond security and defense. And as you surely, all of you in this room know, this issue has now taken a far more critical dimension, particularly in light of North Korea's recent decision to deploy troops to fight alongside Russia against Ukraine. But of course also in light of China's continuing role as a decisive enabler, and this is NATO language, of Russia's war of aggression in Ukraine. Now, it is true that the outgoing Biden administration has actually been an important driver of cross-regional cooperation between the Euro-Atlantic and Indo-Pacific. It's also true that we still do not know how interested a Trump II administration will be in promoting cross-regional cooperation between US allies and partners, or for that matter, how likely it is a Trump administration to treat China, Russia, and the DPRK as an axis and to put that much emphasis on an adversarial axis. That said, it was actually during Trump's first mandate that the United States actually put China and the Indo-Pacific not only at the center of the US national security agenda, but also tried to make it a central theme in the context of the transatlantic relationship. We are here to try and make sense of all these questions and issues, and to get, of course, a better sense of how Indo-Pacific actors and dynamics are likely to impinge on Euro-Atlantic security and vice versa. And to do that, we've got a terrific program, as you may have seen. We're going to begin soon with welcome remarks from Masahiro Mikami, who is Japan's ambassador to Belgium and NATO, and a dear friend of CSDS and myself personally. After that, we'll move on to our high-level panel, who's going to be chaired by the president of our school, Minister Karel de Gucht, a former commissioner, as you know, and also featuring the foreign ministers of Latvia, Canada, and the Secretary General of the External Action Service. After that, we'll move into our two expert panels. During the first expert panel, we're going to zoom in on how strategic uncertainty and also political change, which I was just alluding to, may impinge on cross-regional cooperation between like-minded partners in the Euro-Atlantic and Indo-Pacific. And then in the second panel, we'll discuss alignment dynamics in the Indo-Pacific region itself, and perhaps zoom in on Sino-Russian cooperation, as well as how different powers and actors in Southeast Asia, in South Asia, and in the South Pacific are positioning themselves as great power competition continues to intensify. And finally, we'll have a closing message from General Cavoli, Supreme Allied Commander Europe. Unfortunately, he will not be able to join us physically, but he has sent us a video message and sends his regards and apologies. Now, before yielding the floor, let me just very briefly join Eva in thanking all of those who made this dialogue possible. The government of Japan, of course, and my dear friend, Ambassador Mikami, for their ongoing support and friendship beyond this dialogue. The Australian Department of Defence and the Australian Embassy as well, with whom we enjoy a long-standing relationship. The Indian Embassy as well, Ambassador, thank you very much. A Singaporean Embassy, the Taipei representation here in Brussels, and of course our amazing CSDS team. And last but not least, thanks to all of you for coming out, especially those of you coming from afar, Victor. And I hope you enjoyed the dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Luis. You already said what is coming next. So the welcome address will be delivered by Ambassador Masahiro Mikami from the Embassy of Japan to Belgium and NATO. Thank you.
Your Excellency, Foreign Minister Melanie Joly of Canada, maybe not yet arrived. Excellency Ms. Baiba Braje, Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Latvia, not yet arrived. Secretary General Stefano Sannino of the European External Action Service. President Karel de Gucht, I'm not sure of the pronunciation, but President of the Brussels School of Governance. Professor Dr. Luis Simón, Director of CSDS, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. It is a great pleasure for me to make welcoming remarks at this third edition of Brussels Indo-Pacific Dialogue. About 2 years ago, in October 2022, the Japanese government chose CSDS as a partner to set up the first ever Japan chair in continental Europe, with a lump sum contribution in the form of an endowment. Back to back with its inauguration ceremony, the first edition of this Brussels Indo-Pacific Dialogue was held in November that year. And together with the CSDS Transatlantic Dialogue on the Indo-Pacific in Washington, D.C., it has been contributing to paying more attention to the growing interlinkages between the securities of the Indo-Pacific and Euro-Atlantic theaters. I'd like to express my heartfelt appreciation for the efforts of CSDS for organizing these important dialogues. Indeed, the political realities of today are making it impossible to think about our securities separately. To the best of my knowledge, the first Prime Minister of Japan who raised the issue of indivisibility of securities between the West and the East was Prime Minister Yasuhiro Nakasone at the Williamsburg Summit, G7 Summit, in 1983. In the context of the negotiations over the intermediate range ballistic missiles in Europe and the possible relocation of Soviet SS-20 missiles from Europe to the Far East. But for a long period, the main focus of European attention towards the Indo-Pacific was economic. And it was not always easy to attract enough attention of Europe to, for example, what was happening in the South China Sea, in the East China Sea, and the Taiwan Strait. But the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the Chinese support to it have dramatically changed the perception. And the recent North Korean deployment of its soldiers in Russia is only strengthening it. On the part of Japan too, many of us did not pay enough attention to what Russia was doing in Georgia in 2008. But as a result of the Ukrainian war, we too have developed a strong sense of crisis that today's Ukraine may be tomorrow's East Asia, if I may use the famous phrase of our former Prime Minister Kishida. In addition to this geopolitical change, the rapid development of technologies is making geographical distance and borders increasingly meaningless. Based upon the recognition of the interlinkages between the Euro-Atlantic and Indo-Pacific, the leaders of the IP4, Australia, New Zealand, ROK, and Japan, participated in 3 consecutive years in the NATO summits and discussed pressing security issues, which necessitate close coordination and cooperation between NATO and IP4 partners. Most recently, the defense ministers of IP4 were invited to and attended the Defense Ministerial meeting for the first time in October. I hope that this trend of cooperation will continue, but interactions between government should be supported by high-quality intellectual policy discussions among experts. I'm afraid that the war in Ukraine is entering into its third year soon amid uncertainties surrounding the transition of the US administration from President Biden to President Trump. We have to think about not only the war in Ukraine, but a myriad of other important issues, including trade and economic policy interactions and their effects. As new leadership emerges among like-minded partners in the United States, in EU, and in Japan, closer coordination among us is more critical than ever. At the same time, we also have to find a better way to approach the middle ground countries, so-called the Global South. Thus, this third edition of the Indo-Pacific Dialogue is held at a critical juncture of history and provides a very important venue for in-depth discussion with the participation of eminent experts from Indo-Pacific and Euro-Atlantic regions. I'd like to conclude my remarks by wishing for a fruitful discussion. Thank you very much for your attention.